or financial benefit. The Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative serves as an economic blueprint for renewable energy companies, both large and small, along with increasing market share for African and on renewable energy companies to address the high energy costs at our historically black colleges and universities, to utilize black owned farmlands and HBCU campuses to develop capacity and initiatives for renewable energy projects to bring down the underemployment of young African American men and women locally, nationally, and throughout the diaspora. Also, to utilize black owned farmlands and HBCU campuses to develop capacity and initiatives for renewable energy projects. Also, to educate the African and African American community about the economic impact of climate change and the need for environmental education through Black Talk radio programs such as Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Ronald Bethay, and today's date is February the 1st, 2026. And many of you know that we have been experiencing some extreme weather patterns here in the DMV market area. And we've attempted several times this week to put together a broadcast for this show. And so we're rebroadcasting this episode today, uh, this show today. And being that we don't have a scheduled guest for today's show, we have come up with what we feel is an extreme important uh, subject matter facing the 2026 midterms and the implications that it will have on this current outlaw administration that we have in the overall. Our lead-off topic today, ladies and gentlemen, is how voters are experiencing rising energy costs. Key takeaways for decision makers. Now, this particular article was published by the Evergreen Action Group, and the press secretary, Mrs. Emily Haverstone, uh, sent this out on January the 28th of 2026. So it's a recent uh, article. And this article went on to say, for voters heading into the 2026 elections, rising energy costs have moved from a policy debate to a household crisis across America. Lines Voters increasingly believe that skyrocketing utility bills are inevitable, but the results of deliberate choices by monopoly utility fossil fuel companies and politicians who side with them, this is a perception that hardens. Energy affordability is emerging as a defining issue heading into this year's election cycle, and growing vulnerability for leaders who oppose expanding cheap clean energy. More than 8 of 10 voters reported paying higher energy costs in recent years, and a larger majority say that they are very concerned about the rise in utility bills. Post election surveys in several 2025 state races showed the utility costs ranked among voters' top concerns, second only to grocery prices. At the same time, the outlaw administration and the commander in chief administration unfulfilled promises to slash energy prices have reinforced a broader sense of the system is rigged against them. Well, we will go on the record as saying, I think that this statement is somewhat very, very true when you begin to look at the data. More against the backdrop, voters are talking about energy policy through a practical lens focus on which approaches are most likely to lower their bills, keep the lights on, and prevent costs from spiraling out of their budget controls. Now, these everyday folks, ladies and gentlemen, just like many of are my listeners who are trying to make it from day to day. And I don't have to tell you how voters think about energy. When voters think about energy policy, affordability and reliability comes first. Clean energy aligns with these priorities. Roughly two-thirds of Americans support transitions to clean energy. Majority prefer an energy mix that includes renewables to meet electric needs, and more than 9 in 10 say clean energy is important to the country's future energy supply. However, clean energy resonates most strongly when connected with lower bill prices, stability, enhanced grid reliability, and local economic benefits. Message testing shows voters respond positively to arguments about expanding energy supply when the focus is on delivering a more affordable, reliable power rather than restricting energy options. Polling also shows that more than two-thirds of likely voters recognize those electric grids is aging and the need for modernization, and roughly 65% support building more transmission lines to connect clean energy and strengthen grid reliability. Voters increasingly understand the modernization of the grid and the upgrade lines with smarter technologies and expand regional transmissions can help utilities access cheaper electricity, move more power more efficiently, and avoid costly energy fixes. It ultimately raises households' energy prices. So, what should the solutions that are resonating with voters? I mean, that is the question. And they did pose that in this specific article. Voters respond more strongly to a solution framed around fairness, accountability, and practical steps to lower household energy costs. Finding from the Climate Power Commission survey shows specifically strong responses to these questions. Holding monopoly utilities and fossil fuel companies responsible for rising electric costs, particularly when messages highlight that they delay cheaper and cleaner projects to protect profits. Expanding access to lower cost wind and solar, which voters recognize as the fastest and the least expensive way to bring new electricity online to reduce their bills. Reducing reliance and expanding expensive gas fired power generation, which voters understand as a slower and more costly than clean energy alternative, explaining raising electric prices as a result of deliberate action by utilities, oil and gas executives, and allied politicians rather than unaffordable market forces. In particular, voters strongly agree that adding more wind and solar power helps keep electric rates lower, and utility and fossil fuel executives work to make cleaner energy projects harder to build on because they profit more. Capital intense gas power plants. Messages centered on utility profits move clean energy being a cheaper and faster bill than gas among the convincing explanations for rising electricity prices, especially with uh, swing voters as relates to this. What does it mean politically? Well, you'll find all of that. But the bottom line is this, ladies and gentlemen. As more voters start to make connections, the implications is clear that the decision makers, leaders who champion cheap, clean energy and hold powerful interests accountable for, seen as a standing up for families, while those who block more affordable energy solutions risk being blamed and for rising household costs. In other words, voters believe that energy prices are a choice. Well, it is a choice. And that's just the point why we wanted to open up our show today, Solar Now in the Future with its Economic Impact, and take a deep look at that. And in, in that relationship. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue to look at everyday consumer items. But one of the things that we are very, very clear about, ladies and gentlemen, transportation plays a major role in our energy crisis. And I found that this article, The Myth of Fair EV Fees, How Republicans Propose Consumer Taxes Would Raise Pollution and Costs for Families. And this particular article, also, ladies and gentlemen, was put out by the Evergreen Action Group. And this particular article was authored by Lilia Gregman, and it was published on the 29th of January 2026. This particular article went on to look at the impact of EV fees. Congress is approaching a defining moment for the future of America's transportation system. This year, Congress must pass legislation to authorize the nation's transportation programs, deciding how hundreds of billions of dollars in federal dollars are spent on roads, transit, and other transportation infrastructure. These decisions shape households' costs, public safety, and climate pollution. And current law expires this year. Congress must decide whether the next surface of transportation reauthorization will build on that progress or move the country backwards. At the time when families are struggling with rising costs, and when the transportation remains the largest source of climate pollution in the U.S., lawmakers face a clear choice to invest in cleaner, safer, and more affordable transportation and double down on policies that lock in higher costs and higher pollutions. Yet instead of advancing the solutions, lower costs, and cutting pollutions, Republicans in Congress are proposing a consumer tax on electric vehicles. Now, I find this to be very, very, very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. I spoke with my brother-in-law, Brother Orlando Baylor, who was a family member. Orlando is a retired engineer who resides in Atlanta, Georgia, and his wife, who is who is married to my wife's sister, attorney Gail Scott uh, Baylor, and they have an EV, and I had the opportunity to have Orlando on my show a year or so ago, and he expressed that Georgia was always has already put in a EV fee would drive massive surges of climate pollution and slow EV adoption. EV fee. Now, let's take a look at what this fee is, all the amount of this fee and what this is about. Now, analyze and combined impacts of two federal EV proposals currently under consideration by Republicans in Congress, a one-time $1,000 point of sale fee and a $250 annual registration fee. Together, these policies would make electric vehicles less affordable and gas-powered vehicles more attractive. From 2025 to 2045, these fees would increase transportation sector's climate pollution by a whopping 230 million metric tons of CO2, representing a massive surge in climate pollution and precisely at a moment when the country needs cheaper, cleaner, and transportation adoptions to meet meaningful climate goals in our lifetime. That increase is equivalent to an annual pollution of 61% coal mines, power plants, or 54 million additional gas powered cars on the roads for a year. The modeling also shows that the federal EV fee significantly suppresses EV adoption by 2045. These policies would result to 7.3 million fewer battery electric vehicles and 400,000 fewer hybrid vehicles. In short, meaningful EV fees, large and small, would push consumers away from EVs and toward gas powered cars, locking in more climate pollution and higher and longer costs. In other words, new federal EV laws would renew pollution and push consumers who choose cleaner alternatives. Well, this article laid it out there very clear. That is what is happening right now because of the unholy alliance between the current administration uh, and the fossil fuel industry and the tech industry as it relates to the utilization of natural gas to power turbine technology to power these data centers for crypto mining, AI, and blockchain technology. So we understand that the billionaire interest, which has taken precedent over us as the American working class and consumer, is alive and well with the current administration. Now, the impact of EVP's proposals on climate pollution and transportation sector, you will find a chart there that will give you a breakdown on what this means per sector. The fair share argument falls apart. That's what this article went on to say. Gas-powered vehicles impose major public health and costs EV in the EV reduction theme. Well, we get that. We totally get that, and we totally and understand that. But these are the options that Congress has better options. First, road safety performance standards with explicitly aimed to reduce roadway deaths would prevent approximately 1,000 traffic deaths while reducing climate pollution equivalent to taking in 1.5 million gas-powered cars off the road. Streamlining transit project delivery would save hundreds of millions of annually on project pipelines and ways to reduce climate pollution and relevant to taking off 800,000 gas-powered vehicles off the road. Reauthorization of NEVI charging program would expand charging access to support construction of tens of thousands of new charging ports, accelerate EV adoption, reduce climate pollution, and strengthen domestic manufacturing. The findings underscore a simple reality. Congress has an opportunity to build cleaner, safer, more affordable transportation systems. EVPs move the country in the opposite direction. Once again, let's look at the bottom line. Based on this article, federal EVs should massively increase climate will it massively increase climate pollution, slow EV adoption, and raise costs and families during affordable crisis. There is a simply no version of the EVP that is fair, collectively, or aligned with climate or economic growth. If Congress is serious about developing more affordable and accessible transportation systems nationwide, it should reject EVPs and focus on policies that will expand clean transportation options, improve safety, deliver real savings for Americans and his family. Well, we can all agree on that, ladies and gentlemen, because look at the demand that we have right now as it relates to this unprecedented ice storm, which has hit the northeastern coastline of the United States from Maine to Florida. And we're looking at foot, several feet of ice. I ain't saying people talking about inches. I'm talking about 7 feet, several feet of ice that was frozen to the streets and here in our nation's capital. And if you look clearly at the surrounding counties adjacent to our nation's capital, we're still trying to recover recover from this. And they're talking about another significant storm that has been coming up the East Coast from the South. So we are braced to get hit with another storm. But if it's going to come, we would hope it would be snow and not this type of ice that we just received, got hit with, because this is a different ball game. It's a game changer. Now, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we look back and we were taking a look at why is my energy bill going up, and why is there an attack on solar and wind industry? Now, we in fact had an opportunity to look at this. So, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get right into our archives, and we're going to look at the article that addresses that specific issue for this year as it relates to August. And I thought that this was a very, very timely article as it relates to why is my energy bill going up? Why is there attack on solar and wind? Now, this specific article was written by Charles Harper and Madeline Kumar, and it was published once again in Evergreen Action. They have some outstanding journalists, and they've been doing some great articles on affordability as it relates to consumers as relates to providing options for consumers in the marketplace. It's not your imagination. Your bill in the U.S., energy bills in the U.S. have been going and have been rising. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's not you alone. A recent survey found that 50% of Americans reported feeling overwhelmed by utility costs. But why are bills going up, and what can be done about it, and how can cheap clean energy help? You might be wondering why the energy costs are going up. The answer largely boils down to fossil fuel price volatility, surging in electricity demand, and the impact of the climate crisis. And these higher energy costs come from electric bills, higher natural gas, fossil fuel gas bills, and higher gasoline prices. What causes these higher bills? Now, this article jumped in and it looked at that power bills include both cost and the price to produce electricity at power plants, at the costs, at the grid needed to get it the power to your home or business. Both have gone up. Right now, about 60% of the US electric comes from fossil fuels, including fossil gas and coal. Fossil fuel prices have increased over the last few years, particularly increasing with the war in Ukraine and other geopolitical uncertainty. They remain quite volatile when the cost of fossil fuels need to produce more electricity goes up. It's passed on to you as in the form of higher power bills. To, to keep upkeep costs of the grid has also increased. Hidden reasons for the increase in climate change is, of course, primary causes of burning fossil fuels with more extreme weather and wildfires. Utility companies are paying more to repair upgrades of power lines. And see, this is what is so asinine, ladies and gentlemen. When we look at the numbers of the millions of people who in the deep south are without power because these utility companies refuse to put these damn transmission lines in the ground. All they have to do is put the power lines in the ground, and we don't have to keep going through this broken record because as climate change impacts our community, and we know that this is a recurring practice year to year. Is either ice storms, snowstorms, windstorms. But if you're not doing anything that makes any difference, such as putting the power lines or the grid transmission lines in the ground to prevent trees from having falling on them and breaking the lines. This, I mean, this is a nationwide issue. We're talking about over 50 people have died from this storm that we're presently in. Okay, now, now, what about higher gas bills and gasoline prices? We get that, but what can states do to lower your energy bills? That's something I want to sort of drill down on in this portion of our conversation. Not all energy bills are made equal. What you end up with paying each month in your electricity bills largely depends on the decision your states makes on where and how it gets energy, whether it is invested in energy efficiency building or how dramatically climate change has affected your part of the country. In other words, local policy matters when understanding your energy costs. What do the states with the lowest prices have in common? According to a 2024 report by the nonpartisan think tank Energy Innovation, many of the places that have seen lower energy bill increases since 2010 are states that have built large amounts of clean energy. States like Iowa, Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma that have built the most cheap wind and solar energy have actually seen energy prices increase less than the overall inflation. Which states have the highest energy bill? It turns out that the states most relying on gas and electricity for electricity have exposed the most in higher fuel costs and volatile fuel prices. States that have lost aging coal plants have also sunk large amounts of money in keeping these expensive plants online. Other common denominators of higher cost states with extreme weather, states like California, where wildfires put the grid infrastructure at risk and create financial liabilities, have seen bills go up more than average. States that have gone more energy efficient building and energy efficiency requirements usually see lower energy bills, even with higher prices. If you use less electricity, then you will be less affected by energy rate hikes. Then it goes into talking about the solar industry. How do I lower my bill? Cheap, clean energy. There are several lessons to learn that states have kept the prices down. First, the lesson is that building cheap, clean energy keeps down. Keep clean energy is cheaper than fossil fuel. Wind and solar are the lowest forms of electricity around, and states and utilities build them can also take advantage of the federal tax credit that cuts their costs by 30%. Well, they no longer can do that, ladies and gentlemen, because the 30% federal tax credit has been rescinded for rooftop solar unless they have projects that are already grandfathered in and locked in those 30% tax credits in order to protect that. That went out the window on September 31st, 2025. So this is where we are, ladies and gentlemen, here. And I thought that this was very, very interesting. And if you go to our news and events and go to this particular article, you will see another um, webinar that I prepared and talked about this back in June about this attack on the wind and solar industry. So this sort of gives you undergirds what has been going on. Now, there are uh, many things going on impacting the impact of EPA's axing $7 billion in low income solar for all program impact on black owned companies. I think that's something that webinar you're going to want to listen to, ladies and gentlemen. If you click on that particular article, you'll be able to listen to the webinar. I had at the time I had two gentlemen who were guests on that show, Mr. Will R. Shirley with Sundial Solar USA out of Jackson, Mississippi, and I have Mr. Michael Henry who shared his story of with his company, and he's based out of Florida and Georgia, and he has a national franchise. And we sort of laid out the Mr. Henry shared the blueprint for moving money from nonprofit organizations to solar projects. Uh, and we had a very, very interesting conversation, and you'll be able to go to that specific webinar, and you'll be able to listen to that webinar and the presentation. Now, one of the things that we need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, that the Solar for All program was a pilot program that started here in Washington, D.C. This program started around 2011 by three African American gentlemen of Mr. Mark Davis with WDC Solar. His firm is based here in Washington, D.C. Ted Prayview, who serves now with the D.C. Public Service Commission, is the former director for the D.C. Utility Sustainability Utility. And Earl Green, who is the Burgundy and Gold NFL Hall of Famer, who was a part of a construction company that started the solar ball pilot program here in Washington, D.C. And this program was picked up by the Biden and Harris administration through the Greenhouse Gas Initiative on the EPA, and some $7 billion was put into that program, and it went out to 60 grantees nationwide. And then the Trump administration came in and tried to claw back and rake back all of the funding. Of course, they have been sued for these illegal actions because Congress had already passed, approved the funding for the money to be used for these purposes for the Biden and Harris administration invest in America agenda to combat climate change in this country. So this was a very, very important matter, which did not get totally addressed by the Biden administration. Now, Mr. Michael Regan, who was the former head of the EPA here in Washington, D.C., who was the first African American picked by the Biden administration to head EPA and served in that capacity. And he realized that. So what they did, they parked some $20 billion with the CEFIs, with with the uh, Intertrust Bank, and is a practice that is not new. Administrations have been doing this for years with funding being put into uh, contractual accounts, which uh, have organizations that have already signed agreements with the U.S. government agencies to receive this funding, but they weren't able to get getting the money out of the door. So, of course, there's been quite a bit of litigation going back and forth concerning that. Now, conversations with Ken Mathis, co-founder of NASA Energy Tracking, Inflation Reduction Impact on Manufacturing. That was a very, very interesting show we did here on this platform with Mr. Mathis, and you'll be able to hear that interview with Mr. Mathis and log on to our August events tab. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we have looked at the impacts of of the of the various programs, we also have to go back and look at what has taken place and where we are right now as relates to 2026. We have a very, 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 very interesting scenario because when President Biden came to office, the very first thing he signed was Executive Orders 14006, 14096, 13895. All these executive orders were to put the U.S. on the correct footing in the Invest in America agenda. $1.3 trillion. Many of this was tax credits and incentives that were had put in place, and many of them were grants. So, as we've indicated, many of these decisions are now in the courts. And we had a conversation back in December with Mrs. Deborah Lyles, who is an energy consultant here and a member of our organization, the National Association of Blacks in Solar. And she talked about the impact of 30 loss of the 30% seller, 30% federal tax credit for rooftop solar and the impact it is having on the solar industry, it is it's not a pretty picture, ladies and gentlemen. Matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, when President Biden took office, we had approximately in the U.S. over 13,000 solar installation and design firms doing business in the U.S. We had less than 50 African American firms then. And when we began to look at all of our African American renewable energy companies, design companies, tech companies that are uh, working in the renewable energy sector, you have less than 100 firms. So, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we understand that we as Africans in this country and African Americans, we were still on the outside looking in with the Biden and Harris administration. Then comes 47 in the office. And the first day, January 21st, he signed an executive order revoking the 1965 Equal Opportunities Act passed by the Biden by President Johnson in 1965, a law which has been the a what we would call the stalemate or the uh, main clause to prevent racial discrimination in federal contracting. But he got rid of that. Now they have moved that diversity, equity, and inclusion can no longer be used in consideration in, in federal contracting law. So, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we we've come and we've looked at what impact has this big brutal bill that was passed last year targeting working class people and the poor. And that is a very, very interesting scenario, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to look at that. And the, we had the article to look at what this is going to do as it relates to why is my energy bill going up. That's another very, very interesting article. And then we just shared that with you, and that will be in August also. And I'm going now, and we just shared that in rooftop solar set to struggle under GOP tax re- repeal. Okay, now this was by Dan McCarthy on 8 September the 8th, 2025. President Trump's new budget law repeals key federal tax incentive. Residential solar rooftop solar installations are about to plunge as a result. Americans expected to install 33% less rooftop solar next year than it would if the federal incentive was still in place. Updated analysis from the Omni Analytics, the repeal of the 25D tax credit that knocks 30% off the price of home solar storage will take uh, uh, will make the technology significantly more expensive. The incentive also was originally affordable until 2035. Now, these things were not due to sunset until 2035. Okay? Now we're looking at due to sunset. In 2025, homeowners are expected to fast track solar purchase before the tax credits expire. Expect about 8% decline in installation compared to last year. 2026 total gigawatt solar will shrink. Now, this is what is so disturbing about this. We were on a upward, what we would call projection, and moving forward in a positive direction. Now the clock has been turned, flipped totally on the solar industry as relates to those incentives that were there to help those homeowners. Now, when we look at IPC public statement on EPA's auction for solar for all, market policy is now writing a full chapter on the fossil fuel industry. Now, this is what, as rooftop solar gets hammered, virtual power plants offer a way forward. This is another piece that is very, very informative that you may want to read that. But let's take a look at the financing backdrop with this. These days, fossil fuel executives could be forever feeling their anxiousness, despite all their wildly successful efforts to shape U.S. energy policy. Their favor replaced increasing unfriendly economies with market dynamics and not policy. Pronouncements were being to write the final chapter of the fossil fuel era. For all their influence and wealth, they may feel more like the man staring down the barrel of a mobster's gun and hearing the last word, sorry, it's just business. Show me the money. The numbers don't lie. Data compiled by Bloomberg indicate that financing for oil and coal projects by Wall Street's top 6 banks fell by 25% compared to the same period last year, leading the rest to retreat. Morgan Stanley reduced its fossil fuel financing by 54%. JP Morgan, historically a major supporter of oil and gas sector, trimmed its lending by approximately 7%. Analysts are noting that the first decline of global upstream oil and coal development spending since 2020 coincides with reduction of lending. As Bloomberg NEF analysts put it, the competition of the bank's lending books better measures whether they are having a meaningful energy transmission. Now, what they're saying is that the banks are going to determine, and the lenders are going to determine this Pandora's box that we're in right now, ladies and gentlemen. So you'll be able to find that article up on our news and events tab. But when we begin to take a real hard look at this situation that we find ourselves in, we know that there has been uh, a policy uncertainty in May led to $1.4 million, $1.4 billion in cancellation of U.S. manufacturing investments in May. Now, this is a very, very disturbing policy, ladies and gentlemen, that we want to sort of share with you as to what people really have to lose as it relates to who benefits from what and why. Now, as we have indicated that there has been so many moving parts. 7 ways Republicans sweep tax bills, raise household costs. Now, you'll be able to find that under our news and events, uh, under our news and events tab. Also in May, you're going to find articles called "Poisoning of Black Memphis: Elon Musk AI Plant Spark Environmental Racist Outrage." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to announce that the community in Memphis, Black community, did win their uh, case against Elon Musk, and Roland Martin had the representative from the Southwest Memphis community on his show, uh, and, and talked about this what has been going on in the in Memphis community with these data centers that Musk indicated in his original permitting process. They went and bought off the local politicians, and on the permitting application, they indicated said that they only had 15 gas turbines to power this power plant to power this data center. When they went and checked, they found out they had 35. So this is where we are with that, and that's where we are with that. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we have sort of jumped around and had an opportunity to look at a number of articles relevant to what we're trying to get over to you today, our listening audience. And as you can see, I'm here in my office, and it's been quite an experience with me trying to produce my show in my outside office where I have the privacy I need to get it done. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, this show is brought to you every week by the Positive Change Purchasing Corp, LLC. And we're broadcast over our online digital YouTube radio TV network on our YouTube channel with the Positive Change YouTube channel, online digital radio television network. And also, this show can be heard by logging, of course, to our website at positivechangepc.com. The show is also brought to you every week by the National Association of Blacks in Solar, which is a 501c3 organization, which I'm serving as the present chair of the board of directors. And we have some exciting initiatives that we plan to bring forth here in 2026. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, remember, when you go to our website, I want you to click on on our GoFundMe. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, we're not greedy here. We definitely need some help, financial support for this platform and the show. So whatever you can do is greatly appreciated here on the platform. And I have to ask because uh, closed mouths don't get fed. So we understand that. But that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we want you to pass the word, and we don't want you to meet us here. We want you to beat us back here as we close another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America. Until next week, go in peace.